It's the first in our OHS Reach project webinar series. My name is Sarah McCabe, and I'm the project manager and librarian at the Ontario Historical Society. First, a very quick word about the OHS. The Ontario Historical Society is a non-profit corporation and registered charity, a non-government group founded in 1888, bringing together people of all ages, all walks of life, and all cultural backgrounds interested in preserving some aspect of Ontario's history. Our webinar today will start very shortly. I'll do a very brief bit of technical support, introduce our speakers, and then we'll head right into the presentation. And there'll be 15 minutes at the end for questions. As well, our presenters will be asking for questions during the webinar. Just a few things to go over on the technical side before we get started. In order to ask a question, you just type a question in a space provided below question in your menu bar. If you can't see the question space, you may need to expand the question section by clicking on it. You'll see a space with type a question for staff. That's where you write. Also, if you have a comment to share with the whole group, please feel free to use the chat window. If you run into trouble during the webinar and need my help, you can also use the raised hand button. It's a small yellow hand, also in your menu. Just click it and your hand will be raised and I'll ask what I can do to help. If you're finding that the slides are moving very slowly or your audio keeps cutting out, try closing a few other programs. The more bandwidth you're using, the harder the webinar program has to work. If you lose your connection, try closing the webinar window and then re-entering the room using the link you received in the email. Closing and restarting will often solve the problem. This webinar will be recorded, and that recording will be made available to OHS members on our website after the series, and later the public through our YouTube channel. We will make today's slides available this week, so don't worry about writing everything down. The first of our speakers is Loren Fantin. Loren is currently helping steer OurDigitalWorld, a not-for-profit organization promoting sustainable digitization initiatives for open access to community collections. Her professional expertise includes positions as an assistant archivist, project archivist, and adjunct professor, as well as project manager for online access initiatives. Joining Loren is Jess Posgate. Jess' background is in the humanities and information management. She has been the project coordinator for OurDigitalWorld since 2008. Jess's work includes coordinating digitization projects, database migrations, local history projects, and independent website design. All right, I'm going to switch control of the screen over to Loren. So just a moment while we change views.
Hi everyone and welcome. This is Loren Fantin. And over. So let's see if, there we go. Can everybody see the first slide, project management for digitization programs? Okay, great. Okay, so welcome everybody. Fantastic response to this webinar. We asked on the registration form if anybody had any specific questions. And so what we've done is we've put together a Google Doc. The link is going to be at the end of this presentation, where we've compiled the questions and started to provide answers as well. What you'll note is that some of the questions that you've asked will be answered throughout the presentation. Some of the others we've tried to provide additional links, and we'll continue to work on it. It also provides a form for commenting, so you'll be able to look at your questions, look at the answers, and then provide additional comments. As Sarah mentioned, we'll also have we hope to have time for questions today. We'll have some stops along the way, take a breather, and also we'll have some time at the end for questions. And then also, if you want to talk to us at any other time, please feel free to email us or give us a call, and we'll be happy to discuss what we've been doing. So I just wanted to go through a little bit. So today, we're going to be talking about project and program planning. So it's really a much more sort of the big picture, and I'm just going to say that. Okay. The next session, which is March 30th next week, we'll be delving a little bit more into the nuts and bolts and talking about things like metadata, things like storage, best practices, and so forth. And we're quite heavy with the examples on both sessions 2 and 3. Okay. And the last session, which is on April 6th, we'll talk a little bit more about presenting your collections online. So some of the questions to consider when thinking about different systems that you might be using, different channels for discovery of your digitization projects, how users will access and what it all means. So that's, and again, we'll be heavy with the examples on that end. Okay, all right. So very quick, a little bit, archivist at heart, so always about the context here. So a little bit about OurDigitalWorld. We're not-for-profit, and we've been working on local, regional, and provincial scaled digitization projects since 2005. And a lot of our work really can be boiled down to these three things: working with organizations, from volunteer run to much larger libraries. So we work with the gamut. Interesting projects like, for example, the Multicultural Historical Society of Ontario, working with digitizing their oral histories, and also working on big scale projects like 2 year where we worked with local communities in terms of supporting and starting off community digitization projects. So it's really about how do we make local community history globally accessible. And the important thing for us, of course, is sustainability with all of these kinds of things. So that's where our focus is, and you'll see this throughout the webinars, is really about how can we do things smartly. So we're putting time, money, resources, and our shared digital cultural history is really, really important for future generations. So what are the kinds of questions we need to consider? What are the best decision making? What are the kinds of practices we should be putting into place to make these projects as sustainable as possible? So, and some of the things, I'm not going to, I'll just really run through, but the kinds of things that we do is we provide online access through our Ontario. We've offered toolkits for managing local history collections. We've compiled and worked on newspaper projects and have offered the largest online archive of Ontario newspapers. That's one of the things that in the last couple of years has been a lot of work around newspaper projects and GovDocs, and also we provide resources for digitization project planning. So what is digitization? So one of the things is, to kind of boil it down, is most often people think about capturing the objects. But I have to sort of say that in our experience, looking at things like, what's the best resolution and the best practices around capturing the objects, those are pretty sort of straightforward. It's the easiest kind of thing. It's the kind of thing, though, that people tend to get hung up on when they're thinking about digitization projects, but really that's sort of the most straightforward aspect almost of the whole thing. There's other components which are really important as well, and that is adding value by capturing data about the digital object. And sometimes that can be data that that you offer by capturing metadata, and sometimes it's data that's created and collected from the community. And the other thing, and that plays into the next slide, which is the other important component is how is the digital object and the data, how are they going to be discovered and accessed by the user? Because if you're digitizing something and you're not making it accessible, then again, why are you digitizing? There's also those other things to consider. So this slide, we're probably going to have this slide on every session that we're going to give. It's so important. I can't stress this enough, and that is that the choices that you make really have long-term impact on whether your efforts are going to be sustainable or not, and whether things change. So technology changes, formats change. So the question is, what do you need to be aware of? And how are your decisions that you're making going to impact long-term, whether it's a project or a program? And the other thing that we really emphasize a lot is no matter what level you're working at, whether it's it's a program, a project, short-term, whether it's within a volunteer-based organization, or whether it's within a large well-funded organization, the digital collections really need to be part of the web ecosystem, right? We are 2016 moving forward. It's a very different world, and we need to be connected, and we need to be able to leverage, because that's part of the sustainability of your digital collections. Okay, so starting off with, as we mentioned, the big picture. So breaking it down it's all about the project plan, and some of the things to think about is how is your project plan, how does that integrate with your strategic plan for your organization? How does that work with your community? What is the kind of scale that you can undertake for your project, and how can it be scaled up or leveraged for later? So it's not just thinking about the short-term budget requirements, but it's also thinking about the long-term. And if how can you base your project ideas on some hard and fast realities, in terms of what do you need to get the job done now, and how can you use the information that you've gathered from doing your research? How is this going to feed into your project plan, and then how can it feed into longer-term impact and evaluation? So with anything, really, it's really about starting off with the 5 W's. Like, why are you digitizing? Is it to ensure that people can access the collection? Is it for more preservation purposes? Is it because of a specific event? Or is it because you've received a donation, or you have a sponsor, or there's a town event? So there's a lot of different reasons to consider, and the why digitization also then has an impact on the when, the timelines to consider, the audience that you're going for. Is it a specific audience? And of course, how is that going to be, how are you going to actually accomplish it? So in terms of integrating a digitization project, well, I was, again, always thinking about not just the one-off, but the long-term plan. So how does this project fit in with your organization's mission? And it doesn't matter if, again, if you're a volunteer-run organization, a historical society, or an archives, you really have to think about, how is this particular project going to fit in with everything else that you're doing, and how is it going to fit in with your mission or your mandate? How does it fit in within, within the community that you're working with? So some of the things to consider that will have an impact is, are you going to be partnering with other organizations? And is this a short-term thing that has potential for more collaboration down the road? Things like digitization equipment, so you're buying it for this project. how is then that going to fit in for other things that are going on either within your organization, within your, volunteer society, or things about how are you going to engage the community again with your digitization project. And also, how is this, digital collection, how is that going to integrate with other systems that you have? So, you've got this project, how's the data going to play with, your museum catalog, for instance? So again, not thinking about this as a one-off, but how is it going to impact, your surrounding and your organization? So just very, very quickly about, we're going to be talking about projects versus, programs, and obviously with the projects, we've got a finite start and end date. Oftentimes it's there's specifics. So we're digitizing 500 photos and 2 scrapbooks. And it's one-time grant or funding. And versus program, which is ongoing, and where you're thinking about workflows, you're thinking about standards that are going to be used for your digitization program. Things like standards for subjects, the tools, what kind of systems are you using for managing your digital collections, policies around things like copyright. So it's really about how can you leverage the expertise and resources of the project to help and funnel that into a digitization program. What we've seen in our experience too often is that there is a grant for a digitization project. What happens is somebody gets hired for that, somebody comes in, digitizes it, the project ends, the person leaves, and then it's like, okay, you go for another grant, the cycle starts all over again, and you start from scratch. And really what we want to think about is leveraging. Well, how can we leverage? So, if you're hiring somebody from outside for the project, how is the knowledge and the expertise that they either have and or will gain, how is that going to be transferred to the staff or to the volunteers? How is it, the systems that they use, how is that integrated with everything else? Again, I emphasize a lot, it's about not creating a one-off or an isolated standalone project, but it's really about, again, how can we leverage and how can we ensure that we can build upon what we're learning? Because what often happens is the one-time grant can be used for starting off a digitization program, because that's what we'd like to obviously see happen. So in terms of that, some of the things to think about is, and one of the topics of a lot of concern is funding, and how you can use it to your best advantage. So as I mentioned, how can, think about the one-time grant and how can you use it to fund the first cycle to do things like set up policies, procedures, workflows, metadata standards, and how can that funnel into something that is going to be a digitization program, which should become part of your annual operating budget and your annual activities. That's the kind of best case scenarios. So in terms of funding, you really want to think about the program, right, so to speak. And so how can funders, oftentimes funders want to advance their own causes, and even they'd like to sort of see long-term activities from their short-term projects. And that's one of the things that funders look at, what is the ongoing sustainability of this project? And that's becoming more and more part of the criteria for one-time grants. So the more that you can think about it and the more that you can have that as part of your project plan, the better it is too in terms of being able to successfully apply and be accepted for any grants. So again, how can your present project initiatives be part of the program? How can you work with your community partners in this? Again, oftentimes, you know, there are others within your community who are working on the same set of things. Can you partner with your local museum, with your archives? Can you work together? And what does that mean for the project, but also for ongoing things? So for your project, you're collaborating. That's one of the things that funders like to see often is, you know, what are the partnerships that are happening around this project, but then long term. So if you're, as part of your project, if you're for some reason also acquiring digitization equipment, how is that going to be used after the grant, and how can that, in terms of partnerships, is there a way to share that? So again, it's also always about aligning projects and making those project proposals really, really concrete. Okay. Now, in terms of where to find funding, a number of different things. So provincial federal government grants. So one of the things, for example, that has recently come into play again is Library and Archives Canada has the Documentary Heritage Communities Program, which funds digitization. That had 2 cycles now. Sometimes it's sector specific. So for example, there is funding within the culture sector for museums. There's employment support or training programs like Young Canada Works. That's one of the ways in which people often find funding for resources. Sometimes a corporate donor will want to sponsor an event, and then you can tie in some long-term, you know, some digitization around that. Other times it's raising funds within the community. So, and then often, then again, if you're thinking about project moving to program, is making sure that part of your some of your operational funds also are going into digitization. So really, it's about getting creative. I think the other thing that's interesting too is when we're talking about it doesn't exist in isolation. Really, the healthier the environment, the more funding there is for these kinds of projects. And what we've seen in the last little while, I'd say in the last couple of months, there's actually more talk about digitization again, and there's also, I think, going to be, there seems to be more funding for these kinds of activities, which is really a really, really good thing. Okay. So this question we put up, if anybody wanted to offer any suggestions within the chat window about any additional sources of funding that then can be shared with everybody in terms of where people are looking for funding. So I'm just going to hand this over to Jess.
Okay, so feel free. Hi, I'm Jess. Feel free to keep entering information into the question area for other sources of funding. This is the kind of thing where it may feel like an obscure source. In your eyes, it may be very local to you, but it gives other people ideas about where they can look also locally. So yeah, I'm not sure actually. I'm going to throw a question out to the organizer who's handling the tech support and ask if they can answer Samantha's question about whether or not other people's comments are available to everyone. Meanwhile, just for the sake of keeping it going, I'm going to keep talking about funding and tell you a little story about a group up in Head Clara Mariah. It's on the eastern side of Ontario, and they did a short-term project. It was quite extensive, but it was short-term, and one of the collections that they digitized was about the local dam on the Ottawa River. And so they digitized an enormous amount of material. Well, there's some material, but it did cover basically the installation dam and its effects, and also some of the historical material around the dam building. And as a result of that, they received some sort of spontaneous sponsorship from the Ontario Power Generation Corporation, who funded them with $1,250, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're working in a volunteer-based library or volunteer-based organization, $1,250 can actually do a fair amount in terms of advancing you with more staff hours or more equipment, or certainly buying you more time to continue with the operations. And it's also a feel-good story for the community, where the local corporation is involved and has made themselves known as part of the community and their efforts at the local level. Another example was the Whitby Archives, which is a pretty extensive archives, and they've done lots of digitization. As a result of that digitization that they've been doing in-house as part of their sort of organizational purview, they received an enormous anonymous donation, and they since used that for adding more material to their online collection, as well as digitizing newspapers from paper copy. So somebody thought that this was an important way of spending their personal money, and decided to continue the work being done very well at the Whitby Archives. So Loren mentioned this earlier about partnering and community networking as part of building your kind of your funding proposal, but also in terms of thinking long-term about your digitization project or program. And really, there's a lot of power in partnerships. Collaborative approaches are very much rewarded and valued when you're applying to funding organizations, especially government funds. They want sustainability, and they want to see networked environments at the community level. So consider a few things as you're putting together your proposal and putting together your plan. One is, how will you build your digital collection with a strong foundation in your organization and the community so that it has longevity? This is where partnerships come into play. It's really about capacity building, which is a buzz phrase that you've probably all heard, but it is valuable in that it's about sharing expertise, and it does leverage resources. So the more people that you have involved, the more chance you have for things like job sharing. You can bring in specialized expertise from one organization to help another. You can jointly purchase equipment and maintain that equipment over time. And also it means that you have opportunities for group training and support. So you build a larger knowledge base and a larger resource base for continuing the work over time. It also means that there's more investment in the community and support for the project because of the other content organizations working with you. So we have, at OurDigitalWorld, we work with a fair number of groups who have worked collaboratively, so either sets of libraries, but we also have cross-sectoral partnerships. So in Chatham-Kent, the library, the museum, and the art gallery work together to build a regional portal to their digital collections. And so this is a good way of bringing together the expertise and the resources from all three organizations and the three sectors in a very collaborative and sustainable fashion. It also means that when you work with other organizations, you're expanding the pool of your audience. And it also means that you're expanding, and this is a bit mercenary, but it also expands your labor pool. So the more people who have buy-in through the organization that they are affiliated with, the more chances are that they would be more involved either in a volunteer fashion, or maybe they will participate in fundraising. They may even want to apply for the jobs that you have available for continuing the work. In terms of leveraging the community resources for free labor, consider things like volunteers. So again, when you have more organizations, you have a larger volunteer pool to draw upon for this kind of effort. And also, there are always the things like high school students who need their 40 hours. This is a great way of bringing people together and allowing high school students to have an experience with technology, but also with community heritage and local history. And other examples of this kind of community buy-in or community networking, there's a group, Six Nations Public Library has coffee clatches. So it's not about people volunteering or doing labor, it's about inviting people to the physical space, the brick and mortar space, to look at some of the objects that have been digitized that is not very well described. There isn't enough internal knowledge, and they talk about them and they may recognize people. It's a way of information sharing as well. So all of this is about building community memory. So beyond just the nuts and bolts partnerships of building a funding proposal, you're also building community memory. So here are a few examples of that as well. This is an example from Ontario where a few groups got together and they built a portal to their communal collections. They've built essays and so on. It means that there's a regional view of the north of Huron area. Another includes a regional representation. So they've brought together their local digital collections in a single portal so that you can have a collective representation of the character and the social fabric that makes up their unique part of the world. And this is the number of organizations who are involved in this particular mutual collection. The other thing to consider when you're working with local groups is that you want people who are not necessarily still local to discover the content. So keep in mind that when you're building anything for online discovery, that you want it to be discovered away from or outside of your local website or your local library kind of link and that sort of thing. You actually want things to be discovered far afield, because people move and often they will harken back to a local, to an area, maybe your area, but they've moved away. So it actually is about coming back to that. And we have many stories of people discovering parts of their history from far away, and they're being found online now because people are digitizing their local collections. So just pause for a minute and see if there are any questions about, before we move into the nitty-gritty. And I'm just going to take a quick look at some of the questions that have come up. Okay, so I'm hoping that everybody's seeing each other's comments on the right-hand side. We may try and capture this and add this as well to the document that we're building about your questions. So for the second part of the session is really about planning your project. Now this is going to be fairly high level. I just want to touch on, mainly it's about me asking questions that you need to ask yourself as you start to think about planning a project. Even if you're in a funding proposal stage, these are questions that will be salient to you making very concrete decisions and also being able to plan something that's actually manageable. So just a word of advice that at the heart of digitization lies collection management, and that will probably sing out as we move through the rest of the slides. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So first of all, you need to consider, what is a digital collection at all? Why are you digitizing? Usually it's about preservation, but it's also about discovery and access, and then it's also an element of management. So you want to bring items from your collection, your physical collection, online for other people to access, but you also want to be able to manage those things, and you also want to be able to preserve those things. So this is what a digital collection should actually accomplish for you. So as Loren mentioned earlier, digitization programs are sustainable. Digitization projects are usually one-offs and not necessarily built for sustainability unless they're in the scope of a larger program. So keep that in mind as we move forward as well. Always think about things in chunks So it may be that you're doing things in smaller batches, but you're always building toward a larger goal. In terms of building good digital collections, whether they're in the short term or the long term, planning for sustainability includes things like metadata. You need to make your objects discoverable, and that means using existing standards, authoritative terms, and making sure there's consistency in how that metadata is entered and discovered. Make sure that the system that you use for managing the data and the digital objects allows you to get your data out. Not only just for discovery purposes, but if you ever need to change systems, upgrade, etc., make sure that you always have a way of getting your data out. Because standalone systems, if your data is locked in, you may lose it over time through obsolescence. Also think about who your users are, so that you can start building your metadata and your access points to match the expectations of your audience. And is it easy for them to use the system that you've chosen to use to build your digital collection? And have lots of interactive options. That's always fun for your audience as well. That also buys build-in. So that's part of building a good digital collection, is having community buy-in at the end. Now, one thing that we'll note on this slide in particular is that a good digital collection, we haven't even talked about the digitization yet. That we'll talk about a little bit more in the second session, but it's actually about the access, the discovery, and the sustainability of your system and your data that will keep your digital collection alive. Now, generally, when you're doing project management, this is kind of a rule of thumb. Nothing is ever as you expect it. So always build in that knowledge ahead of time that if you plan everything to the nth degree and it screeches into the deadline, chances are you'll be past the deadline. So build yourself a little bit of slack as you're moving through your project planning. Project management fundamentals. I'm going to walk through these kind of subsections at, like I say, a very high level. They're just things to think about when you're starting to consider building a project plan. Really what you're trying to do is be very specific and be realistic about your goals, your timelines, and your deliverables when you're starting to plan a project. Really, when you're planning, it means knowing what you need done, how you need it done, who's going to do it, and by when. Anticipate that something inevitably will go wrong and how you're going to work around those things and those times. Build in time for evaluation processes and also for measuring progress. Keep in mind that reporting and documenting should be part of your mandate as well, because that helps with following cycles of digitization projects. And don't forget to build in some promotion and publicity, because there's nothing like building something that you are so incredibly aware of and then nobody else knows and you run out of money so you can't tell them. So think about that as well. Like, always just have those things as part of your project management planning sort of main staffs. Now, this is a reminder that project planning continues throughout the project or the program implementation. So you'll notice that the green section on the timeline here is the planning process. Of course, the main part of it will be at the beginning, because you're working hard to plan it. You start executing it, but meanwhile, you're always planning as you go. You should be constantly assessing, reiterating, and kind of maneuvering through the process. It is not a static thing. And also just a reminder that this is probably the beginning of a single phase of a project. So this would be a project inside of a program. You would be doing this over and over and probably have it overlapping to a certain point. So talk a little bit more specifically about some of the aspects of planning a project, staffing is an enormous part of any digitization project. So while you're thinking about staffing, the things to consider are how many people will you need? And all of these, you can't do them in an order. You need to assess what it is that you're digitizing first and how you're going to do that before you can assess how many staff. But just keep all of these components in mind. So consider how many people you need. Are you planning on using internal staff? Because this will need to work within their existing jobs, and how will that work? If you're using external staff, who will they be? How are you going to hire them? Where are they coming from? And what will be the budget for hiring those people? Because if they're internal, chances are you can use existing funds, but if you're hiring externally, then that's an additional budget item. In terms of hiring new people, if you are hiring externally, you need to have very concrete job descriptions. You need to have a recruitment process, interviewing. All of these things take time. So while you're planning your project, consider that you won't be able to start hiring anybody or even put out a recruitment ad until you receive your funding. So it's only then that you'll start the process of asking for people to apply. Also consider what you will have to do to attract someone to your area if they're coming from away, if they can't commute or if they're not local. How will they be housed and so on, and join your community for the duration of their time? What are the skill sets that they'll require, and what will be their responsibilities? These would all be part of their job description, but be very precise and know what you need. And then lastly, and it's sort of a soft factor, but what is the impact of having new people in your work environment? So this is everything from the logistics of, too many people in the lunchroom, or where their desk would be, to the personalities, because bringing a new personality in is always, it means change. What kind of space use will they need? What will their workflows be? And what will be the administrative requirements? What's the overhead of managing another person in your staff? So here's just an example of a job description. I'll just say now that at the end we have a link to a folder online that has a bunch of different example forms and things like job descriptions, work plans, timelines, and so on that you can refer to for examples, and this will be part of that folder. Now, I know we had a few questions in the registration process about how to budget, how to consider what every digitization, what the costs will be. It's hard to say that concretely because every item will have a different sort of formula for determining what it is. Generally, though, what you need to do is identify the items, and we talk about this more in session 2 with inventorying and what kind of best practices there are for different media types. But whether you're working with born digital or analog will make a difference, and whether you are working completely in-house or if you're outsourcing any of the digitization obviously will have a big impact. But basically, in terms of determining a digitization cost, you need to think about what the tasks include to digitize the item. So there's the retrieval and preparation of the item, there's the conversion of the item, there's the description of the item. So all of those are about time and equipment and skill set. And then you have to consider things like the difference between digitizing an audio cassette, which has the full playing time for transferring that material over to a digital format, plus there's going to be enhancement for that. So that depends on the quality. And then there's the editing and conversion for web. So it's about bringing it down from a master file down to something that's more deliverable on the web. And then you multiply the amount of objects that you have that are that media type, and how much is the staff wage for the hours required, and then you might be able to come up with a figure that you can actually calculate forward for your digitization activities. As Loren mentioned, a few years ago we managed a 2-year digitization project that was, it took place in 10 different communities. And so at the end of that 2 years, we did a postmortem and took a look at how the money was allocated for that entire 10 cycles of digitization. And what it came down to was staffing. So 92% of the money went to staffing, and that was training them, them implementing things, them planning. There was travel involved, there's no question. But in 10 locations, I think we had, overall, there were 22 people involved over the course of 2 years. The equipment and everything else fell under 10% of the budget. So keep that in mind when you're starting to build in your budgeting. It's not about fancy equipment necessarily. Get what you need, certainly, but that is not going to be where the main part of your outlay is. It's about hours and time. Now, as a project manager, the things that you'll want to have in place, or if you hire a facilitator to do this, is to have some very concrete workflows and work plans in place so that people know what their responsibilities are and who's charged with doing what, in what timeline. So keep this in mind. Who's going to be charged with what parts of the process? Do you have multiple people or just one person? So if it's one person, how will they divvy their time up? In terms of timelines, sketch out a project plan that outlines the anticipated timelines for the program. If it's in cycles, how do you want those cycles to roll out? But count on the first cycle taking the longest, generally, because that's the one where everybody's learning and you're setting up an awful lot of the basic materials like policies and best practices. How are the best practices going to be integrated into the workflow? So that may be things like when the metadata gets applied, at what point does it get applied? Anticipate parts of the workflow ahead of time that will require policies. So collection policy, if you're gathering new material, copyright policies for after you put things up on the web, you need to establish what the copyright of the material is and also how you will respond if somebody challenges that copyright or has questions about it. End user communications, how are you going to publicize and display and promote the collection, and think about things like policies around scanning, storage, and so on. And we talk a little bit more in depth about this in the second session. Also in the second session, we'll talk about metadata application profiles, which is you building a schema of metadata for your objects that is consistent and has descriptions so that you get proper metadata attached for access points, but also that it's consistent over the course of your project and also your program, and everybody knows what's expected in terms of a description. And then the digitization process itself. So consider how things are going to be processed in a logistical way. In what space will they do it? We've had examples where the assistant was working in a small office space and the scanner was beside their desk, and that was fine when they were working on photographs, but then they got into working on large-scale maps, and so they had to then wait until the organization was closed for the day, closed to the public, move the scanner out into the public sphere, and have a larger table so that they could scan these large-scale maps in a different space. So things like that will also be dependent on the items that you're working with. As I mentioned, nothing ever goes as planned. So this is the if-then component of project planning. Try and anticipate ahead of time risks involved in the project that you're planning and what rate of risk they are. So what kind of gauge how risky it is. It may be that you're worried about your assistant leaving or you run out of money. There are things that you absolutely cannot anticipate. There was a project I worked on where the developer's father died, so that changed up a timeline there, and then we also had a laptop stolen with all the images on it, and that changed up a timeline. Those are the things you can't anticipate, but keep it in mind, and also try and plan for what you would do to alleviate those problems. The best thing you can do in project planning is to always be able to have something going at all times so you're constantly making progress. So always have overlapping timelines and priorities. Now we all know about scope creep. This is the inevitable, oh, you're doing a digitization project. You know, I have this collection of stuff from my mom's house and it would be fabulous to have it online. And you say, oh, that sounds great. And then suddenly you have 18 mom projects going on and the one that you originally planned has kind of fallen by the wayside, or it's gotten so bloated that you can't actually accomplish it within the timelines. Be prepared to say no, but also be prepared to say yes, but, and have it for down the line. So say for this project cycle, we're actually doing this. This is the scope of this project, but we'd like to invite you to bring that stuff back when we're ready to take it on next time and have a later iteration. It's the best thing to do because then you continue to have the buy-in. But just be aware that scope creep is there and it can actually sink you if you don't manage it. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but measurement and evaluation all the way through is a very good way of keeping people motivated, for one thing. So you want to set goals, right? You set milestones all the way through the project about things you can achieve, either number of items digitized or when you want to make certain cycles public, online, and so on. It means that there's always something to work toward. It also means that you've got something that you can then measure back on to record the productivity and your success statistics. And these are great for writing reports for your board or your funders and so on. It also means that you have something that you can learn from and improve upon. So you've got some hard figures and facts that you can work with for your next iteration. How do you do it? This is about scheduling milestones. So you should always have milestone goals throughout a project, no matter how small. Be proactive about reporting to your partners and boards and even your community groups, whether they're involved or not, but try to inform them, incite their interest, and also show the motivation of your group to get the job done. And lastly, you want to document the process. Any changes that happen, things like job descriptions, if they have to change, keep a file, keep a folder. This will also help when the program is reviewed. If you need to do a postmortem on it, it helps you to streamline, it helps you to identify issues, rejig workflows, and so on. So that's the important part about keeping documentation. It's often the hardest part because you want to keep working on the actual do part of the project. But this is part of managing a project, and it will serve you well over time. So I think skidding in, speaking of which, skidding in at the deadline, just in summary, in terms of planning a project, both the big picture and kind of at a more granular level, you always need to think ahead. Consider every opportunity for collaboration and do them and collaborate strategically. Make sure that you have clear objectives. Try to anticipate problems and provide contingency planning. Document everything along the way. Learn from those experiences because it is an iterative experience overall. And lastly, and we'll talk more about this, but share your information. Nobody's working in a vacuum. So the more that people can talk about their experiences, share their experiences, nobody's going to take that away from you or monetize it and become rich because you did a project and shared your information. It will help everybody's projects get stronger. So the more that we can share, the better off.
And share both the good and the bad, or the not so good, right? I mean, we all like to talk about our successes, but we learn a lot too from, if I had to do it again, I would do this differently because this part didn't quite work out as I had anticipated. And I think that that's really, really important in terms of sharing information is people learn from things that work and things that don't work as well. Okay, so we are just kind of coming into under the wire. Are there any questions at this point? Wow.
Okay.
Okay, so we're just looking in the chat window. As I mentioned at the beginning, the questions that were on the form, we started a Google Doc, which is going to be shared with everybody, where we've compiled questions and answers, and we can certainly try and add more things.
So we have some specific questions here. So what do we mean by sustainability? I think we answered that in terms of it being something that can be sustained over time through knowledge sharing, good practices. It's not about the physical sustainability. That would be more of an archival thing, I think, and it's more about sustainability of the digital collection and its life online.
And what are the kinds of things that you can put into place to ensure long-term, you know, regardless of the formats or the technologies that are being used, because those things are going to change, right? But so what are the things that what are the decisions that you're making now that are going to have an impact in terms of the format changes? What kinds of things can move forward regardless of the format? If you do certain things, that comes into play.
And can we clarify what metadata is? Well, the pat answer for that is it's data about data, which is not very clear.
And we'll be talking about that next week. In the next session, we're going to delve down into what metadata is. But it's just data about data. So it's things like geographic information. It's things like you know, who created it. So information about the object is really what we're going to focus on.
Specific provincial or federal funding, we probably won't take time to name things here, but you can also use the question sheet that we're going to share at the end. In fact, I'll just move to that now so you can see it. At the very bottom, the bit.ly link is to a Google Doc where we have a question and answer. So if you have more questions, feel free to pop them in there too, and maybe people can come up with some names, and we'll pop some specifics into that as well.
Sometimes, in terms of the provincial or federal funding programs, it really kind of, again, it depends on sometimes it's dependent on the theme. So, for example, there's the Canada 150 funding, and that'll, you know, that's focused on a certain theme. So if your digitization project falls within that, and then there's other criteria assigned to it. So it's very hard, it's very difficult to talk about these kinds of things because it is specific to what you're digitizing, you know, the themes, the content types, all that has an impact.
I'm seeing some questions about recommended systems and so on, and this is a question that was asked in the registration as well. So I'll refer you to the end link at the bottom of this slide to take a look. We provide a system. It's not the only one out there, so I'm happy to, you know, I threw our link in there for the Vita Toolkit, but I've asked if people would please also recommend other systems to you so that you've got a bit of crowdsourcing.
And I think in that, can you describe the type of equipment needed? So that depends. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week when we get into different formats. In terms of, I'm assuming that means digitization equipment for different types. Okay.
Hopefully, Iona, I think hopefully you're seeing the Google Doc link at the bottom now, and we could also email that out potentially at the end. Have we experienced working with Chin? Not particularly, but if you have a specific question about that, I'd be curious to know it if you want to pop it into the Google Doc. Oh, John. So we're actually trying to talk more about project management in general, not so much about the Vita Toolkit. If you're interested in the Vita Toolkit, we can certainly talk about that on the side. We're always happy to talk about Vita Toolkit. We will talk next week about more specific things about digitization, capturing metadata, and a lot of the examples will come from the Vita Toolkit, as well as at the end, the third session, when Loren talks about interactivity and that sort of thing. So those will be more specific to the Vita Toolkit. But if you're interested, just drop us an email afterwards, or we can talk on the phone. And yes, I know. I think we'll try and capture these links and send them out a different way because they aren't interactive through the slides. So it looks like we answered most of the questions. Please do take a look at the Google Doc and throw in your 2 cents. There were a couple that I didn't answer, and Loren has yet to get to them so that she can add more information. We come from different angles at these things, but we'll keep it sort of a living document, and as the questions grow, it should become a bit of an FAQ as well, so you can always refer back to that. And don't forget the sample policies and workflows as well that you can access. We also have a web page where there's sort of more high-level resources about digitization, project management, and approaches, as well as standards and best practices. So that's the first link on this screen. And I think we've taken you past your noon hour, so happy lunchtime, and I'll just let Sarah finish up.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you next week for the next session.
Hi, everybody. This is Sarah again. Thank you so much, Loren and Jess. That was terrific. Just very few words from me. Just to remind you that the links will be in the presentation that will be emailed to the attendees afterwards, so you'll be able to access all the resources, the terrific resources that have been provided. Let me do a quick change presenter to my screen. And just 1 second here. It's just to let you know that the next webinars in our series will be Kim Pittaway, Canadian journalist, editor, and consultant on strategic planning for heritage organizations. This will be Thursday, May 26th. And after that, the OHS is excited to let you know that we're offering a class or a webinar on Ontario Archaeology 101 with archaeologist Paul Racher, who's president of the Ontario Archaeological Society. And that's on Thursday, June 23. Also this spring, there'll be a webinar on information technology planning for heritage organizations. So please visit our website to register, or you can email me for more information on these sessions. Just a little word about membership. We encourage you to become a member of the OHS if you're not already. The Society's programs and services offer great support and resources for historical groups and institutions, historians, students, educators, and your support will help continue to promote the importance of history education in Ontario's classrooms, museums, and heritage spaces. Please visit the OHS website for more information on becoming a member or contact our membership coordinator. Thank you, everyone, and see you again for part 2 next Wednesday, March 30 at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.